Hello everyone, I am the storyteller. And today I am here to help you have a restful sleep. I know you're using this video to drift off more easily. So relax and whine and let the story guide you into your dreams. Before we begin, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching this video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of the exciting stories in the future. In 2014, when I was just 18 and still very naive, I started exploring Craigslist. Without much thought, I responded to an ad in the personal section and began texting with a woman. At that time, I didn't realize the hidden dangers, nor did I question it when she suggested meeting at a Red Roof Inn. I didn't even think twice when she mentioned donations. I innocently assumed it was just polite talk, thinking it was voluntary. With that naive mindset, I arranged to meet her. That day, it rained heavily as I left my house, not for my GED class like usual, but heading straight for the hotel. The downpour soaked me to the bone. When I knocked on her door, she answered wearing something rather provocative, something that should have raised red flags. But I just smiled and walked in as if everything was normal. I asked if I could take a quick shower since I was drenched and uncomfortable. While I was in the bathroom, she started undressing, but I politely declined. "No, it's fine. I'll be quick." She lay on the bed, her eyes glued to the TV, not saying much else. After my shower, I wrapped myself in a towel and stepped out, my heart beating faster. I asked her if she was ready, but she simply lay there, eyes half closed, and said, "Donations are mandatory." At that moment, all the warning bells in my head suddenly went off. I realized I was in a serious situation. Looking at her indifferent face, I awkwardly told her I didn't bring any money. What happened next left me frozen. She jumped up and screamed at me, throwing my clothes and bag out of the room. I stammered apologies, saying I didn't mean to waste her time, and hurriedly dressed before dashing out of that stifling room. The rain was still pouring down as I left the hotel, but the panic inside me was far more overwhelming than the storm outside. I tried to walk quickly out of the parking lot, just wanting to get away as fast as possible. However, before I could leave the area, a light blue Volkswagen appeared out of nowhere, and the driver called out to me. I tried to ignore him and walked faster, but his voice shouted louder, forcing me to stop. As I approached the car, I could sense the danger in his gaze. He sat behind the wheel, his left hand resting on the car door while his right hand was casually gripping a gun. I nearly stopped breathing, every cell in my body tense with fear. He asked in a stern voice, "Why did you come here without any money?" I tried to stay calm, explaining that I didn't understand what was going on. He lifted the gun slightly so I could see it more clearly and said, "I have the messages between you and her, saying you had money." I tried to insist once again that I never told the woman I had any money. After a few tense moments, he lowered the gun and said something that made my blood run cold. "You're lucky you met one of my girls. Others might have stabbed you with a broken crack pipe by now." He raised an eyebrow, flashing a cold smile. "I see you're young, so I'll let you off this time. But don't ever get caught around here again." I nodded, thanked him, and hurried away as fast as I could. Every step I took, I didn't dare look back, terrified that at any moment, a gunshot would ring out behind me. That was the first, and the last time, I ever met someone from Craigslist. A chilling lesson about the dangers of being young and naive, one I'll never forget. This story happened when I was just 16 years old. At the time, I worked at a small Subway shop in a quiet neighborhood, and I always thought that making sandwiches was a safe, uneventful job. But I was wrong. Very wrong. It was a regular Saturday evening, much like any other. I was working the late shift with an older coworker, someone I believed I could rely on in tough situations. The Subway was unusually empty, leaving just the two of us to clean up and prepare to close the store. It was around 9:30 p.m. Outside the glass doors, the night had fallen, and the dim streetlights barely pierced the silence. I had grown used to the quiet, but a sense of unease crept in when a strange man walked in. He didn't look like a normal customer. Wearing a black hoodie pulled over his head and face, he glanced around for a moment before approaching the counter. As the men drew closer, something in me froze. He wasn't looking at the menu. Instead, he pulled out a handgun and pointed it straight at us. My coworker and I stood still for a moment, unable to believe what we were seeing. I could feel the blood rushing to my head, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. "Give me all the money," he growled, his voice cold and threatening. The gun gleamed in his hand like a blade ready to cut through any resistance. My mind raced, my hands trembling. The world seemed to tilt around me. I didn't know what to do, but instinctively, I slowly opened the cash drawer, never taking my eyes off the gun. I pulled out the small bills one by one, hoping that if I moved quickly enough, he wouldn't get agitated or hurt us. But things weren't that simple. "Hurry up. I don't have all night," he snapped, his eyes full of menace. I could feel the chill from the gun and the danger lurking in his gaze. By now, my coworker had snapped out of his shock, silently signaling me to comply with the robber's demands without saying a word. I handed him the cash, trying to keep my hands from shaking too much. In that moment, everything around me faded into a void. All I could hear was my racing heartbeat and see the gun aimed at me. As he grabbed the money, he glanced at his watch and quickly turned to leave, as if something scared him. The subway door shut behind him, leaving an eerie silence in the air. Neither of us dared to breathe a sigh of relief just yet. I stood there, still clutching the cash drawer, my mind blank. My coworker turned to me, his face pale but much calmer than mine. "It's over, he's gone," he rasped. It took me a few minutes to shake off the numbness. We quickly called the police, and they arrived not long after. I can never forget the feeling of helplessness and terror, facing danger so close. Though the robbery didn't leave me physically harmed, the memory of it remains etched in my mind, reminding me that sometimes danger can come from the most ordinary of situations. And on that night, I learned a valuable lesson about how fragile life can be. That night, at 14 years old, Mai found herself home alone for the first time. Her grandparents had left to pick up a distant relative from the train station, promising to return before midnight. It was just after 9 p.m., and the house felt eerily quiet. Mai had always been a little uneasy in her grandparents' old house, especially with its creaky floors and shadow-filled corners, but she reassured herself that everything would be fine. She lay in bed, scrolling through her phone, trying to focus on the comforting light of the screen. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and a light rain began to patter against the windows. Everything was perfectly normal until she heard a soft, creaking sound. At first, she thought it was just the old house settling. But then, the noise became more distinct, a series of slow, deliberate footsteps above her head. The attic. Mai froze. Her grandparents had mentioned no one else would be home. Her mind raced. Was it an animal? The wind? Or someone? The footsteps seemed to grow louder, moving across the ceiling as if someone, or something, was walking directly above her. She swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. Every instinct told her to stay calm, but panic was creeping in, gnawing at the edges of her mind. She slowly got up from the bed and, with trembling hands, locked the door to her bedroom. The silence that followed felt like a suffocating weight. Then, another sound, the creak of a door opening, not in her room, but somewhere in the hallway outside. She barely breathed, every nerve in her body straining to listen. The slow, steady thud of footsteps on the stairs began. Someone was coming down from the attic. Mai pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding so loud she was sure whoever was in the house could hear it. The sound of footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, as if the intruder knew exactly what they were doing. When the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, everything stopped for a moment. Then, the soft shuffle of feet resumed, this time coming towards her room. She clutched her phone tightly, too terrified to make a call. Her fingers hovered over the emergency button, but she was frozen. What if they heard her? Just as she steeled herself to dial, a new shadow appeared at her window. A dark figure. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but no, it was real. The figure was there, standing perfectly still, watching her from the other side of the glass. Her breath caught in her throat, eyes wide with terror. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure stood there, silhouetted against the pale glow of the street lamp outside. Slowly, the figure raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, fingers splayed, as if trying to feel the cold surface separating them. Time seemed to stretch on forever as Mai stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on the figure. Then, in the blink of an eye, the shadow vanished. The hand slid off the glass, and the figure dissolved into the night like smoke blown away by the wind. But the house was still. The footsteps had stopped, and the only sound now was the rain gently tapping on the windows. Mai, still paralyzed with fear, didn't dare move. She didn't sleep that night, waiting for her grandparents to come home, too scared to unlock the door, too terrified to open the curtains and check outside. When morning finally came, she found herself curled up in the corner of her room, phone still in hand. The house was silent, and sunlight streamed through the windows, chasing away the shadows. Her grandparents came home soon after, apologizing for getting back later than expected. Mai wanted to tell them what had happened, the footsteps, the figure at the window, but as she looked at their tired, concerned faces, she hesitated. Had it all been a nightmare? Was her mind playing tricks on her? To this day, she still isn't sure. But every time she visits her grandparents' house, she avoids looking up at the attic. And she never sleeps with the curtains open. In the quiet of a winter night, Emma sat in the living room of her newly purchased home. She had just moved in a few days ago, into an old house with a long history. One night, as the cold wind howled through the cracks in the doors, Emma decided to go to bed early, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. Before going to bed, she turned off all the lights in the house, leaving only a small lamp on a table next to the bed for a faint, comforting light. When the lights went out, Emma noticed a shadow on the wall. She tried to dismiss it, thinking the dim light from the lamp was creating an illusion. But then, within a few minutes, the shadow became clearer, moving as if it was watching her. Emma decided to check the house to make sure nothing was amiss. She walked through each room, inspecting every corner but found nothing unusual. When she returned to her bedroom, the shadow had disappeared. She felt relieved, but just as she was about to get back into bed, she heard a faint whisper in the room. The voice seemed to be pleading for help. She turned on the light and checked the room once more but saw nothing unusual. Just as she was about to turn back to her bed, a loud noise came from the bathroom. Emma cautiously opened the bathroom door and saw the mirror on the sink cracked. While she was fiddling with the mirror, a cold breeze suddenly extinguished the light. In the darkness, Emma felt as though something was standing right behind her. She turned around but saw only the murky night. As she turned back to her bed, the shadow on the wall reappeared. This time, the shadow took the form of a woman, her arms outstretched as if searching for something. Emma couldn't sleep. She sat up, watching the shadow, feeling as though an invisible force was trying to pull her into the darkness. Desperate, she quickly turned on the bedroom light, and the shadow vanished. That night, Emma couldn't close her eyes, and the next morning, she decided to call a feng shui expert to check the house. She never found out the mystery behind the shadow, but from then on, she always felt like something was watching her in the house. The old rug. Daniel had just moved into a small house in the suburbs, and one of the first things he brought with him was an old rug he had stumbled upon at a thrift store. The rug was colorful with strange patterns and very old, but Daniel thought it would make his room cozier. As soon as he laid the rug on the floor, he felt a strange change in the atmosphere. That night, when he was asleep, he was awakened by a faint tapping sound, as if someone was knocking on his room door. When he opened his eyes, the rug seemed to be undulating, as if something was moving beneath it. Daniel decided to investigate. He lifted the rug and found nothing but the ordinary wooden floor. But from then on, every night, the rug displayed odd phenomena. The patterns on it seemed to change from normal images to dark and frightening ones. Sometimes, Daniel even felt like someone was pulling the rug under his feet, making him uneasy. One night, while Daniel was reading in the living room, he heard a soft knock on the window. When he looked outside, he saw no one, but dark shadows began to move across the rug. He decided to remove the rug and throw it away. However, as soon as the rug was removed, the strange occurrences in the house stopped. Daniel realized that the rug might have carried a spirit or something terrifying. Since then, he has been cautious when buying used items and has never encountered a similar situation again. The puzzle piece. Sophia had just moved into a small house in the suburbs, which had a beautiful and peaceful garden. While cleaning the house, she found a small, old box in the basement. Inside the box was a puzzle set, featuring images of an old house. Sophia was intrigued and decided to assemble the puzzle. When completed, a chilling image appeared, a house identical to the one she was living in, but with some strange details. The picture showed a window that Sophia had never seen in her house, along with a shadowy figure standing in front of the door. Since completing the puzzle, Sophia began to feel a strange presence in the house. Every night, when the lights went out, she heard faint footsteps and whispers of unknown origin. She checked each room but found no one. One night, while Sophia was sleeping, she was startled awake by a loud noise. She ran downstairs and saw a new window opening up exactly where the puzzle had indicated. This window was not part of the house's design and led to a dark, foreboding space. Sophia couldn't resist her curiosity and stepped through the window. She found herself in a strange garden with puzzle pieces scattered on the ground and an old house in the distance. As she approached the house, she felt a menacing presence watching her. When Sophia returned to her house, she realized that the puzzle had changed. The image on the puzzle now depicted herself standing in front of the window she had just discovered. She felt a shiver down her spine and decided to get rid of the puzzle. But from then on, strange occurrences continued, making her feel as if there was a mysterious connection between her house and those puzzle pieces. Maybe this Christmas we should all be a little more grateful for the gifts we receive. You never know who might take the rejection to heart and plot a terrible, bloody revenge. A few Christmases ago, while driving my kids back from visiting their grandparents out in the countryside, they had moved to a big old house once my dad sold his business, one of those offers you couldn't refuse things, which meant he could retire about 10 years earlier than expected. The house itself is amazing, the only problem is that it's in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the nearest village is a 20-minute drive away. It's also one hell of a drive to and from the place, involving traversing some pretty secluded stretches of motorway. So, like I said, it was maybe only a week before Christmas, on the 16th or 17th of December. My kids were really excited about it. My little boy was 5 years old, a true Santa believer, while my daughter had just turned 9, so they were starting to cotton on that something wasn't quite right about the whole thing. But they still sort of wanted to believe, if that makes any sense. When they saw a hand-painted Christmas light dripping sign that said something like, Santa's Grotto, 9 miles, they started going ballistic in the back seat, demanding that I take them to see Santa. At first, I straight up refused. It was a long enough drive without pulling over to some labyrinth to spend the better part of an hour nattering away with some old fellow in a red suit. But the pair of them threw an absolute fit to the point where I decided I would get far more peace if I just capitulated and let them spend a few minutes indulging their childish imaginations. Like I said, my eldest was just on the cusp of figuring out that Santa was just mom and dad sneaking out in the middle of the night to take their presents out of the car before stashing them underneath the Christmas tree. Every time I imagined her getting older, wiser, figuring things out, becoming a young adult, it had me choking up like nobody's business. So, I suppose I just wanted her to enjoy her naivety just a wee bit longer. Besides, once she figured out the truth, it was only a matter of time before she spilled the beans to my youngest, and that was the day I most definitely wasn't looking forward to. After a few more signs, like Santa's Grotto, 3 miles, I finally saw the turnoff that I needed to take to get into the grotto. It led me down a long, dark dirt track that, at first, I thought might have been the wrong turn. But lo and behold, after about 5 minutes or so, I saw another one of those janky hand-painted signs for Santa's Grotto. The kids were just about ready to burst at this point, but I made it clear that we weren't staying any longer than 10 minutes and that they were to be on their best behavior, leaving when I told them to leave. At least Santa could see what bad little children they were. The thread of coal in their stockings was more than enough to have them promising me they would be good. So anyway, I expected a quaint little winter wonderland type of thing with a few other families milling around. But the place was barely even decorated and looked completely deserted. It was a little more than a porta-cabin with a few caravans parked around it. I'm not messing when I say that whoever was in charge of this place had put more effort into decorating the road signs than the actual site itself. I had a bad feeling from the get-go, but I knew better than to reverse myself and tell the kids to get back in the car. They would have gone absolutely mental getting so close to meeting Santa, only to be told that I just up and changed my mind. So, against my better judgment, I decided to give the place a chance. We walked up to the porta-cabin, which seemed to be the place where the grotto was, and knocked on the door. There was no reply at first, so we knocked again. As we did so, one of the doors to the caravan swung open. This heavy-set older fellow with a big gray beard stuck his head out and gave me a death stare. I looked over at him and, in my cheeriest voice, asked, "We're here to see Santa. Is he around?" I gave a quick nod towards the kids to signal to the fellow, who I was guessing was the one playing Santa, to get himself together so the kids wouldn't throw a fit. He didn't say a word at first, he just stared at me, almost as if looking through me, like there was nothing behind those eyes at all. He finally said something like, "I'll go and fetch him," then shut the door, only to re-emerge a few moments later dressed in what was, without a doubt, the worst-looking Santa suit I'd ever seen in my entire life. Not only was it lacking any kind of white felt, there was no belt or anything. The bloke had pretty much just rounded up a collection of red clothes and then slapped on a cheap Santa hat to complete the look. On top of that, the clothes were absolutely filthy, covered in grease stains with a collection of what appeared to be cigarette burns in the pants. He walked towards the kids and asked them if they were excited to see him. They exchanged cartoonish looks as if to say, "Who the hell is this guy?" Then the bloke asked the question again in a characteristically festive voice. Before they even really twigged to the fact that this was Santa Claus, they just sort of nodded, watching in confusion as he took a key from his red pants and unlocked the porta-cabin before beckoning them inside. The interior was absolutely terrifying. Like, I'm a grown-ass woman, and even I got the creeps from stepping inside. It was dark and grimy, and the use of cheap Christmas lights managed to give the place a kind of festive torture chamber vibe as opposed to the cozy grotto feel. The crowning piece of creepiness was the fact that mounted on one of the walls was what I guessed was an old sheep's skull that had some plastic deer antlers taped or glued to the top of it. It would have been creepy enough in broad daylight, but the fact that it was being partially, then fully illuminated by red and green flashing lights gave it a truly hellish aesthetic. Santa sat down on a grubby old couch that stunk of piss and old ale and smacked his knee as if to invite the kids to go sit on his lap. Neither of them moved. Their lack of reaction prompted Santa to give them something of a scowl before he curtly asked them what each of them wanted for Christmas. Both of the kids were so nervous at that point that I had to prompt them to reply. The awkward exchange went on for a few more minutes until I turned to the kids and told them that we had to leave. As I was ushering the kids out of the porta-cabin and back towards our car, I felt a hand grab the crook of my arm and squeeze. I turned to see Santa's face pushed right up against mine, his breath reeking of cigarettes and hard booze. "50 quid, he hissed. "Sorry, Santa, I haven't got anything on me," I said, trying to be as polite as possible but maintaining a passive-aggressive tone. "But I promise me and my husband will leave out some extra brandy and mince pies for you on Christmas night, just to make up for it." I don't even know why I was keeping up the pretense at that point. I was pretty sure the whole experience had scarred my wee lad for life and had pretty much destroyed any remaining festive belief in my daughter. "Epic B," the Santa growled at my back. That's definitely not exactly what he said, but I'm trying to keep this all PG-13, so to speak. I just kept pushing my kids back towards the car, turning back briefly to see that Santa was no longer alone. He was never alone. A gang of other people had filed out of the other caravans and were following us back towards where I'd parked the car. They started up a chorus of, "Where do you think you're going, love? You haven't paid. He told you 50 quid. Get your purse out, or we'll get it out for you." My kids were on the verge of tears at this point, and if I'm honest, I wasn't far off either. I gave in, took out my purse, and started sifting through to see if I even had 50 quid in notes on me. Right as I was doing that, this kid, this actual bloody child, just snatched the whole thing out of my hand and ran back towards the caravan with it, only to be goaded on by the gang of skanky-looking grown-ups with, "Good lad. That'll teach her. Be needed to learn some generosity, it is Christmas after all." I didn't do a bloody thing, well, aside from getting in the car and driving off. The damage control from that bit of horribleness was a hell of a lot of work. I'm pretty sure it was the singular event that broke my eldest kid's belief, and we had to reassure my youngest over and over that he was just a bad man pretending to be Santa and that the real Santa would most definitely be putting him on the naughty list for what he'd done. But honestly, I think it's me that belongs on the naughty list for putting my kids in that position in the first place and for experiencing the most terrifying Christmas-related event that I've ever gone through. Far, far scarier than my first Christmas with my mother-in-law, if you can believe that. In the summer of 2012, I took a job as an expedition canoe guide on the boundary waters in northern Minnesota and southern Ontario. These are massive wilderness areas of lakes and land. I was working for the Boy Scouts and we were based in Moose Lake on the US side. My job was to facilitate a fun and safe multi-day trip, anywhere from 7 to 12 days out. Most of that summer was typical, but the one expedition in particular still haunts me as a result of what happened to us over the course of a few days. Here is the account in full. My crew was on the younger side. There were 9 of us total, the maximum allowed in a group per a permit. There were 6 scouts, 2 adult supervisors, and myself. They had wanted to do a 200-mile trip but didn't have the physical ability, so we had to amend our route. They were bummed out, so I decided to take them to a waterfall called Eddy Falls. It's pretty flat up there, so there's a waterfall that is somewhat rare, but that decision would end up putting us in the path of something. We visited the falls and camped near it that evening. I had the boys working on setting up camp while the advisors worked on the fire for dinner. I was collecting firewood in a big tangle of downed trees, brush, and bramble. I could faintly hear the falls off to my left when, out of nowhere, I heard the most unearthly scream or roar I've ever heard. It stopped me dead in my tracks and I was completely frozen. The second scream was closer, the third even closer than that. I couldn't see anything due to the thickness of the brush, but whatever this was coming directly at me. By the fourth scream, I could feel it in my chest. I got nauseous and involuntarily barked at it. I've never before or since heard that sound come out of my body. The fifth scream almost physically hurt, but it snapped me back to reality and I ran back to our camp. My crew had heard it too, but what was I to tell them? I claimed it was a boar, but there are no boars up there, and the advisors knew I was lying but didn't call my bluff. After dinner, they went to their tents and I retired to my hammock that was about 50 yards from camp. As a rule, I always set my hammock up at head height, so it's about 6 feet up. I would use a tarp over my body and head to keep the morning dew off and the morning mosquitoes at bay, but the tarp wasn't strung up, that's important. It was just loosely over me. It must have been around 3 to 4 a.m. when I was awakened by what sounded like a woman sobbing, not an outright cry, but a sob. At the same time, I was hearing something walking through the thick brush down past my feet. So I listened, totally still and quiet, as it crossed into camp. I could hear the change from brush to granite rock but could still hear its heavy footfalls as it walked right through the camp. Dawned towards me at this point. The tarp is still over my head so I can't see a thing and I don't know what to do. In no time it was standing right next to me. I could hear its breathing, loud and congested sounding. I could smell the musk. I could feel its enormous presence only inches from my body, just standing there. Time to make a decision. I suddenly threw the tarp off my head, and as I did this, my left hand touched this thing in the chest. It was dark, but I could make out briefly a very large upright figure. Its hair was long and coarse, and the frame itself was impressive, like a bodybuilder's. I ended up touching its pectorals. It all happened in a second, and as soon as my hand made contact, it bolted back into the brush with immense speed for such thick debris. By the time I got my headlamp on, it was gone. My crew had slept through all of it, so I waited until the sun came up and decided not to mention it to anyone. The next day, we moved on to a few miles towards a base camp and camped at Osama Island. Campsites on the US side are designed with a fire pit and a grumper, which is a fiberglass toilet over a deep hole. When we arrived, it was evening. One of the adult supervisors needed to visit the grumper, so he walked towards it. About 2 minutes later, we heard him yelling, and he came running back to the camp, still pulling up his pants, saying he had just seen a gorilla run right in front of him. I asked if it might have been a bear, and he said absolutely not, that he had hunted bears for years and that was no bear, it was a monkey, and it was about 9 feet tall. With this height estimate, I'm imagining that if I touched the chest and it was about 6 feet off the ground, that puts the head close to 9 feet up. Was it stalking us? Were there more than one? All the boys were now scared. It was time to mitigate. I suggested a night paddle. No one was sleeping anymore anyway, so we packed up and set out around 8 p.m. and paddled by headlamp for several miles. My plan was to get back onto Moose Lake and camp very near to base so we could be the first crew off the water the following day. Moose Lake is connected to Newfoundland Lake by a small pinch and a channel of water that's not very deep or wide. We were right in the middle of the pinch when a rock the size of a baseball came flying out of the woods on the right side, narrowly missing the bow of the canoe I was steering. There was no cliff there, this thing was forcefully thrown at us from the tree line. At this, we paddled like hell, paddled to the center of Moose Lake, tied all 3 canoes together, and stayed out there all night. At sunrise, we paddled back to base camp and ended our expedition. No one wanted to talk about what had happened, and I was okay with that. They left for Oklahoma the next day. After they left, I went to work a shift in the canoe yard, helping crews offload. My buddy Justin had just returned from a trip in the same area we'd been in. He was in the Bear Loop. As I was helping him put the boat on the rack, I noticed he had a distant look, almost a 1,000-yard stare. I asked him how his trip went. He said it was all good until they hit Knife Lake and Newfoundland Lake. He said they had been messed with for a few nights on Knife and then had a rock thrown at them in the Newfoundland Pinch. Sure enough, for a solid 2 weeks after that, crews kept coming back from that area with very similar stories, screams, rocks, sightings of apes. Then, from the back corner of the room, I heard a chuckle. It was one of the old veteran guides who'd been there for over a decade. All he said was, "It's about time somebody else saw one." I asked how long he'd known they were there. He said he'd been encountering them for around 10 years now. Then he said, "They talk to me." This shocked me. Like a language? I asked. No, they communicate telepathically. The less you acknowledge them, the less they'll bother you. But they can read you, and they like it when you're afraid. It's a game to them. What happened out there is still a big question in my mind. I've always been open to the idea of Sasquatch. Their existence was never a huge stretch for me. But what really sticks with me is the way that veteran guides spoke of their intelligence and the parapsychological abilities, that they can read human emotions as clearly as pages in a book, that they know our species better than we know ourselves. So I'm a 24-year-old male. I've lived on my own for about 2 years now. I have a very small bungalow I can afford quite comfortably. In this bungalow, I have an attic area. I'd guess it's about 5 by 5 meters in size, and you can only really stand in there at the very center. Anyway, I work a night shift at a factory. I basically just sit on my phone all night, so I usually get home around 8 a.m. I was coming home last Thursday during a heavy storm, got into the house, and just went straight to sleep. When I woke up, I went on my phone and saw that I was so tired that I didn't check my notifications. I have a Ring camera outside my door, which shows me anyone who would have come into my room. I saw that it had been tripped around 7:42 a.m. I had gotten home between 8:10 and 8:15. I checked the video and saw that it was a man. He was pressed right up to the door and was fumbling around with the handle. He did this for about 10 seconds until he spotted the camera. Once he did so, he very quickly scuttled away. This unsettled me, but it didn't entirely creep me out or anything. I got up to make some food and discovered something in my kitchen. My back door was now open. I, of course, instantly began having thoughts of a home intruder, but I slowly convinced myself that I had left it open. The rest of the day consisted of me noticing small things that didn't seem right and scaring myself until the point I left for my shift at 10 p.m. While watching TV around 9 o'clock, I spotted something that made my heart leap into my throat. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the entrance to my attic being slowly slid open. I vividly remember questioning my sanity, thinking I must be hallucinating. I looked over and saw something that scared me even more, fingers wrapping around the hatch and beginning to move it more. I didn't know what to do. I could feel the panic really starting to get to me. I wasn't sure if I should leave the house and call the police or try to yell at whoever was up there. I chose a mixture of both and began dialing 999, then ran to my bedroom where I could lock the door. As soon as I began running, I heard the hatch almost get torn off with the speed at which they moved it. I arrived at my bedroom door, looked down the corridor, and saw only a little slice of darkness up in my attic. I saw human hands still holding onto the sides of the ceiling. I yelled, "Whoever is up there, I'm calling the police and I have a gun. If you take a step out of there, I will shoot you." The adrenaline was really making my hands and voice shake. I tried to sound as tough as I could and saw something that I truly do not think I will ever forget. The hand slipped back into the dark and then he dropped down. I slammed my door shut and locked it as quickly as I could. The call went through, and I was able to get on the line with the police. They dispatched officers to my house. I told them I didn't know if the man was armed or not. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line. I heard the man walking up to my door and rattling the door handle. He also seemed to go through my cupboards in the kitchen, as I heard a lot of commotion in there. Truth be told, I don't know why he stayed. I would have just left the house, but he stayed right up until the police came and arrested him. Apparently, he was a homeless man armed with a knife from my kitchen and had recently been seen in the area trying to get into other people's houses. Truth be told, I'm very frightened to sleep still. I now sleep with my bedroom door locked and all my windows closed. I also sleep with a knife under my pillow. I know this is unlikely to ever happen again, but I just cannot forget the way he dropped down from my attic. So that's the story of the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I made this account to tell it because I feel like if I write it down like this, it will feel less like a real thing and more like a story. If something happens to me, it was the guy in room 235. This happened an hour ago. I work at an upscale hotel in one of my state's most affluent suburbs. Like most hotels, we were struggling during the virus. Our rates have been slashed in half to get guests through the door. Our clientele has shifted from upper-crust business people to a mixed bag of characters. It's mostly been fine with a couple of notable exceptions earlier on in the pandemic. Cut to tonight, I'm working overnight alone, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. About 3 hours into my shift, I get a call from room 235. It's a strange voice, it's quiet, raspy, and maybe has an accent. He tells me he can't figure out how to work the TV remote to his TV. I assume maybe the batteries have died, but he insists that the remote works just fine. He doesn't understand how to operate the volume button. I find this strange. I've worked in the hotel for 5 years and not once encountered someone who didn't understand the TV remote. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt. The volume button is like the Guitar Hero strum switch, you have to press a single switch up or down to navigate. Also, working in customer service, you come to realize that people are much, much dumber than you want to believe they are. Since I'm alone at the hotel and not technically supposed to leave the front desk, I tell him that if he comes down to the lobby, I will gladly show him how it works. This upsets him. He grunts and starts complaining that our customer service is terrible, saying, "What kind of hotel wouldn't have the attendant come to the room for something like this?" I give in, he's only 1 floor up, and it can't possibly take long to show someone how to change the volume on a remote. Everyone is checked in, so it's just not worth the argument or the bad review later. So I tell him I'll be up in a moment, knock on the door, and do the customary call out, "Guest services." I can faintly hear him talking to someone, it's murmured, and I can't pick up any distinguishable words at first. It felt like he was instructing someone else to get the door, and I anticipated it opening up shortly thereafter. The talking went on for so long that I wondered if maybe the people in the room hadn't heard me. I was debating knocking again when the deadbolt slowly unlatched. Normally, when I go to a room, the guest opens up the door wide and stands to the side to let me in, or at the very least, opens the door enough so that I can fully see them and they can fully see me. Not room 235. He barely cracks the door, it's open maybe an inch. Even weirder, all the room lights are off. It's entirely dark except for the faint glow of his TV, which is on but the volume turned all the way down. His voice sounds exactly like it did on the phone, raspy and whispered. He's standing behind the door, so I can't see him at all, completely disembodied. He instructs me, "Come on in, sweetie." I say nothing and I don't move. I guess now is the part where I tell you I'm a smallish, 5-foot-tall woman with a baby face in my mid-20s. "Come on, come inside." He sounds more edgy, more insistent this time. It feels so obviously like a trap that if it wasn't absurdly on edge, I would have been insulted. How naive does he think I am? I push the door open but remained as much in the hallway as possible. I also took the opportunity to reach for the light switch just inside the door. The room lights up, and I finally get a look at him. He's at least 60, white-haired, and slim but with a little gut. He's shirtless, wearing pants, but his belt is undone, and the ends are flopping down. I'm not entirely sure because I try not to look, but I believe his pants are also unzipped. He appears to be completely alone in the room, the only piece of luggage is a small black duffel bag. I quickly try to explain the volume switch from where I'm standing awkwardly in the doorway, but he isn't comprehending it, or at least he's acting like he isn't. I ask him to give me the remote so I can show him. He backs further up into the room. "You know, it'll be easier for both of us if you just come inside," he gruffly tells me. For a brief moment, I think I see his eyes glimmer. I made it through the night. My boss wasn't very concerned and felt badly. He apologized if he ever made me feel like I had to go into guest rooms alone while on the property and made it clear he does not want us to do that anymore. For the record, no one has made me feel like I have to do that. All of the front desk staff do it all the time. I usually don't, unless it's one of our regulars who just needs a new roll of toilet paper or something. I did in this instance because it seemed like it would be quick, and while he sounded weird on the phone and I hated his voice, I didn't expect it to go as it did. You encounter a lot of weird people working in lodging. Usually, I feel like I can tell the benign from the malignant. Obviously, it was a bad call on my part and I was wrong in this case. I've learned my lesson. As for not calling the police or my boss right then and there, I felt like I was potentially going to be in harm's way while standing in the doorway, and he was actively being a creep. But when I got downstairs to my lockable office with my security cameras, I just remained anxious and on high alert. I had decided if he called again, I obviously wasn't going up there, and if he came to the desk, I would have called 911 on my cell just in case. We're 2 minutes from the police station, and there's usually a patrol car hanging out in our shopping center. They show up quickly anytime I've had to call. I also like to think critically before I call the police for any reason. I've called them on someone for being very similar, just weird but in a slightly different way, and was told that unfortunately, he technically hadn't done anything and to call back if he does. I don't really believe it would have gotten anywhere. I didn't call my GM because he lives 45 minutes away. I'm not really sure what he would have done. Even if he offered to wake up and drive the 45 minutes to the hotel to replace me on my shift, I would have refused because I need the money. Thanks for everyone's concern and for checking in on me throughout my shift. I wrote the post because I couldn't believe what had just happened, and I needed to share it with someone, even anonymous people who don't know my location, to feel less alone during the process. I also eventually got in touch with my girlfriend, so I had a real person with my real address keeping tabs on me as well. A few years ago, I was working at a pizza chain in my hometown as a driver. I was 27 but made darn good money delivering. I'd worked at a few other places, both local and chain, in the years before and still work as a dasher on occasion even after this happened. Now I choose to deliver in much safer areas for this reason. I got luckier than I could ever imagine. One night I was working and had a double, both orders were cash. I had $12 left in my bank, and the first order went smoothly. The guy gave me $50 for a $35 order, so I was excited about the nice tip. I drove to the second delivery. It was at an apartment complex with multiple buildings. I'd delivered there before. The sun was about to set, but it was still very light out. The chain I worked at had us drive company cars with the logo on it, white sedans. This is important for later. I grabbed the order and went out to the door of the apartment building. The young guy came out, and a much bigger, older guy was outside smoking a cigarette. The big guy went inside as the smaller guy came out. He looked around nervously and asked how much he owed me. The way he was looking around made me very nervous. My hairs stood up on the back of my neck. I told him the amount, and he said that wasn't what he was told on the phone. Again, something felt very wrong here. I felt someone else walk out behind me from the door just as the first young guy looked around down the parking lot, craning his neck as if he was looking for someone. I told him the amount again and broke down the order for him, trying to keep calm. Then the first guy held a gun to my right temple. I also felt a poke on the back of my spine, 2 gunmen. I couldn't speak, words wouldn't form no matter how hard I tried. "Give me your money and your keys now," the first guy growled. I fumbled immediately for the keys. I gave him my money and didn't realize the 50 was mixed in. I gave him the keys, trying my best to remain calm. Then another guy came up on my left. He looked to be around the same age as the first kid, the one behind me I still hadn't seen yet. The big-haired kid grabbed the pizza bag and ran off and hid. The first kid searched the company car. Luckily, I had left my wallet in my personal car. I saw him grab my cell phone. That's when the panic began to set in. There were pictures on that phone that I hadn't backed up of my 5-year-old son, who is my absolute world. Please, please don't take that. I have pictures of my son who died on there. It's all I have of him. Please, I lied. My son is very much alive. The kid behind me spoke softly. Trust me, just listen to him, he'll get it back undamaged. I don't to be here either. I could tell he'd been crying by the way his voice sounded. A car pulled in, and the 3 boys took off from the other end of the complex in full sprint. Before the one behind me took off, he accidentally dropped the gun right in front of me. It was a standard issue 9mm, silver and black with the safety off. It looked completely real to me. He picked it back up and ran with the others. The car that pulled in saw me. It was a woman and her kid. Panic set in as I realized they could easily come back and do way worse to me. I collapsed. They had taken my company car keys, $72, the pizza, and my phone. The woman ran up to me and asked if I was all right. She took me into her apartment in the next building over and locked the door. I was shaking so hard I couldn't even hold her phone to call 911. As she set her kid down, her boyfriend, I assume, helped me call. I spoke to the operator and told her everything. I'm colorblind, unfortunately, and these guys were obviously wearing all black and white clothes. Thank God I got a full description of two of them. The poor woman who helped me was going to be late for work, but she still stayed until I was off the phone with the cops. Man, she was harsh and blunt with the operator, but I will never forget this woman's utter kindness to me and her boyfriends. The cops showed up and contacted my store. My manager brought out the spare keys for me to drive the car back. After dealing with the cops, I drove back and was greeted by crying and beyond worried coworkers. A lot of them were terrified that I was hurt. It actually meant a lot to me how much they cared, and thankfully I was still fine. I filed the proper paperwork, and the $72 was written off as a loss to the store. I was told by my boss to take the rest of the night off and take care of myself. He actually gave me a hug, and to this day, he is still one of the best bosses I ever had. What I didn't know was that I was in for a very long night. I called my best friend before I left the store and asked where he was. We usually meet up for drinks after work, and he was around the corner at the bar, so I met up with him. His dad was a District 4 cop in the city at the time, the same district this happened in. He told me his dad had given him a heads up and had 2 shots waiting for me to calm my nerves. After those shots, we played pool when his dad called his phone and asked if I was with him yet. He then handed me the phone. His dad asked if I would come down to the station. I was honest with him, told him I had those 2 shots and I'd been drinking, so I couldn't drive. They ended up sending a squad car to get me since it wasn't that far away. Once we got to the station, I was informed that they already had suspects in custody and I was needed to ID them, 3 boys and a driver. They'd been caught less than 20 minutes after the robbery, speeding. The bolo had already gone out, and they matched the description. They'd used the money to buy weed and gas and then taken off. They had at least 15 stolen cell phones on them, and the order had been placed on a stolen phone. My phone was in the mix of the box. The police told me to grab my phone only, and I did. I unlocked my phone and then told them all the details once again. I also mentioned that the guy who was behind me was obviously bullied into this and asked to show him some mercy. I pointed him out as the one in the white shirt. The police then informed me that he was the one that was talking. The other 3 denied involvement, and that's when I found out about the 4th guy, the driver. He was completely unaware of the robbery and was just picking up his friends. He was thankfully never charged. The one behind me and the one who grabbed the pizza were 15 and 16 and got 6 months of house arrest. The only reason the one behind me got off easy despite having the gun to my back was because I asked them to go easy on him, that he seemed like a good kid who didn't want to be there and he was the only one confessing anything. So the last kid was 18, the one who put his gun to my temple. He got the book thrown at him. The plea deal he was given was 8 years. It's now only been 4, and he's getting out early due to overcrowding, not good behavior, overcrowding. It's this coming February, but I'm ready if he finds me. My wife, my parents, everyone I know knows his face and his name. If he tries anything, we are all ready. But for his sake, let's not meet again. I apologize if this isn't the right sub to post this story, and if people think it's better suited somewhere else, then please let me know. It's taken me years to work up the courage to post this story to strangers because the events that took place all those years ago left me puzzled and frankly disturbed. It's perhaps best if I provide some background and context because it may help strengthen my story, and people will hopefully believe me. I know that a lot of people claim to have a true story about strange encounters in the woods, and I don't want people to accuse me of making all of this up because honestly, I swear this really did happen. It's not supernatural, it took place during the daytime, and the quote-unquote monster is very much human. When I was approximately 13 or maybe 14 years old, it would have been 2003 to 2004, I went on a camping trip with my mother and stepfather and 4 of my younger siblings. We're not a very well-off family, in fact, we were actually quite poor. I never went on holidays abroad, and we would never go camping if we did. It was usually to the same campsite, which felt like miles away but in reality was just less than 10 minutes from the city where we lived. We had actually been there a few times previously and knew the campsite as well as the surrounding area fairly well. It felt safe and familiar. On this occasion, everything was going pretty normal. I myself hated camping, but my parents would argue when it came to putting up our tent. It was just so boring being in the woods. I would normally be the one entertaining my siblings. I hated not having electricity and access to proper toilets and showers. It could be quite fun looking back, and I do treasure some of those memories I have with my stepdad, who's unfortunately no longer with us. Usually, we would go on long hikes or bike rides with my stepdad, using maps to chart our way to a small village, promising to get us all ice cream, which was a real treat we never really had. On this camping trip, we were going to go on a 10-mile bike ride. Both my parents had their own bikes, along with my sister and me. My stepdad's bike had a small trailer where my 3 younger siblings, all under the age of 5, were set. It was hard work going through these epic long rides, but I rather enjoyed being in the middle of the woods surrounded by nature. We weren't in the middle of nowhere, but it was remote enough to be inaccessible to public transport. Only forest ranger-type vehicles could access the roads we were on. They weren't real roads, like paved with tarmac, it was more like dirt roads, which were only suited for bicycles. During all the times we went camping, we never saw any other vehicles go down these roads. On this day, we were cycling down this road when suddenly we heard the sound of a vehicle coming up slowly behind us. My stepdad was in front of us when he told us to stop and move aside to let the vehicle pass. There was a sense of urgency and confusion in his tone as he was unsure why there was even a vehicle here. The vehicle passed us, and we were expecting to see a forest ranger vehicle, like a 4x4 Land Rover type of vehicle, but instead, we saw one of those station wagon types of cars, the ones with the long body, large trunk, and the window in the back of the station wagon. We saw several large trash bags. It was a very strange sight. I may only be a teenager, but it's a sight that set off alarm bells for several reasons. 1. This is not a car designed for going off the road. As previously mentioned, we've never encountered any vehicle down this bike path. 2. The person driving is clearly not lost, as they didn't stop to ask for directions or anything. These big black trash bags look very suspicious, and by that point, they were all fully tied up, very tightly. We could all see into the back of the car, and I saw nothing poking out to indicate that it was full of garbage. The driver looked very rough. I don't mean to sound rude, he just looked very mean. I can't recall his features exactly, just that he didn't look like a friendly person who belonged in the countryside. He wore dark clothing, I think he was clean-shaven and had short hair. I wish I remembered more about what this man looked like. As if this incident couldn't get any stranger, what took place next has left such an impression on me that I still recall that sense of fear I felt at the time. My palms are getting sweaty and my heart is racing just writing this post. The car drove on several more feet and then the driver stopped what felt like the longest time in my entire life and nothing happened. We were just sitting there watching this car. My stepdad has now told us to remain still. He's very serious as he's assessing the situation. Then the car's reverse lights come on, and it starts backing up toward us. Stepdad goes into full panic mode and tells us to run. We don't even get back on our bicycles to ride, instead, we all flee on foot, running with our bicycles through the woods until we reach a railway bridge which we had previously passed over. We never looked back. I have no idea if the man got out of the car to go after us or not. I don't know if he just continued driving. I still have no idea who he was or what was in those bags. We never really spoke about what happened that day. I know it was something serious enough that it scared my stepdad because of his response, and it's left me frightened about who I might encounter in the woods until this very day. I was 18 years old and had just graduated high school 3 months prior. I was married. We'd rented a very small one-bedroom house that was across the street from the bank where I worked as a teller. We hadn't lived there very long, maybe a month or so. We were young and barely making ends meet, so there wasn't a lot of decoration or things around the house, etc. I was always a very trusting person. I was raised in the country and in times when you could leave your windows and doors unlocked. It always taught me to see the good in people. I'd come down with a cold and taken cold medicine one night and went to bed very early. At this point, I'd only been married for less than 6 months, and I remember feeling someone messing with me in my sleep. My half asleep, Cold medicine bogged down head started reacting and thinking it was my husband. Then I roused up and opened my eyes. It was around 2 a.m. I looked over at my husband, kind of laughing, and said, "What are you doing?" Only he was sound asleep, facing the other direction. Puzzled, I looked forward. At the foot of my bed, a street light was shining in my window. Crouched there was a gray-haired man. He was looking straight at me. It was then I noticed this weird smell, alcohol and food mixed together. I immediately registered that something was very wrong. Out of a natural reaction, I screamed. When I screamed, my husband jumped up facing me at almost the exact same moment the man jumped up and ran out of the bedroom door. The bedroom door was located right by the head of the bed on my husband's side. Since he jumped up looking at me, he did not see the man run out. He asked me what was wrong, but I was so scattered, nothing was coming out of my mouth or making any sense whatsoever. He kept saying, "It's okay. You just had a bad dream, and everything is just fine." I can't describe the panic I felt inside. I refused to lay back down. I got up from the bed and walked into the next room, which was our living room, and my husband followed me. Once we entered the living room, it was all becoming reality. The front door to the house was propped open with a brick. The rocking chair we had was moved out of the way of the doorway to the bedroom. My assumption was he was making sure he had a clear view of the house, with everything scattered on the floor along with the contents of my purse. A few dollars were missing, my social security card, a change purse, and a photo. Since we were young and broke, we didn't have a home phone and cell phones weren't common at that time. We were trying to get dressed and put on shoes to call the police when we heard a car door slam. I started screaming, "Oh my God, he's going to steal our car." My husband went to the door and saw a female officer walking toward our house. I immediately started rambling about a man who was in my house, who had messed with me, touched me, and that I needed help. I know I looked like a crazy person babbling nonsense. The officer calmed me down and asked me to tell her what had happened, so I repeated myself. She asked if I knew what he looked like and if I could identify him. I told her I could. To this day, the man's face and hair haunt my thoughts and dreams, it's permanently imprinted in my mind. She then explained that she was making rounds and had spotted a man running across the road suspiciously. She had stopped him and was taking him in for public intoxication. When he got into the back seat, he was trying to stuff my change purse into his pocket. She took it from him and cross-referenced my social security number to find out that I lived just a road over from where this man was picked up. I consider it a divine intervention. The man claimed I was his friend and that he had just left my house not long ago. My house was fingerprinted, photographed, and diagrams were drawn. They tested his hands and fingerprints for my DNA. I had to go to court and testify. I found out I was pregnant just a few weeks later. I had constant nightmares and became very jumpy. The stress from everything threatened my baby, so we agreed to a plea bargain for aggravated sexual assault and battery, among other charges like breaking and entering and theft of property. I found out he was living in a camper parked in front of the bank where I worked. During that month, I was a teller assigned to the drive-thru, and I faced his camper daily. I walked to and from work because it was just across the street and driving was more effort, plus we only had one car. They also found other items from my house inside his camper. When searched, it confirmed he had been in my house before. He had actually seen my husband in the bed next to me and walked around him to my side of the bed. He was clearly on a mission. I finally got through court and he was sentenced. I tried to move on. About 4 to 5 years later, I received a phone call from the police department in a city over. A new law had been passed requiring all prisoners for actual offenses to submit their DNA. There was a match. The same man who broke into my home had been linked to a series of high-profile cases in the next city over. They were brutal, and no one had ever seen him. Only one girl had seen tattoos on his arms. He would tie up his victims and use tape on their eyes. Shockingly, we all had similarities, he obviously had a type. The girl who saw the tattoos had given a description, which was broadcasted on the news. I guess he ran to the next town in hopes of escaping. At the time, they caught him at my house with tape and everything on him. It didn't make sense why at that time. Now, all the pieces have started to connect. He was a serial offender. All the victims were between 17 and 23, and this man was almost 60. Then, years later, I realized that had I been home alone, if he had broken in during my lunch break when I was alone, it could have been so much worse. I didn't have to deal with some of the horrible things that the other girls did, but it still really messed me up. It caused marital problems for us because I didn't feel protected and I still have PTSD. But I'm very lucky. God was watching out for me, and I'm thankful it wasn't worse than it was. By far, this was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. Sorry it was so long. It's not something I tell a lot of people. I had a friend who didn't believe me at first, saying it sounded too crazy until she saw the sentencing on the news. I was used as a witness for the other girls' cases, showing the man's criminal history and all the similarities. He was sentenced and put away for the rest of his life.